Good morning, Title I coordinators. Thank you for joining us this morning for our December
thank you very
webinar.
much, but I really wanted to.
As you're joining,
very
please be
sweet, though.
sure that you've muted your microphone. Thank you.
Have a good day, Cody. Thank you. Bye.
All right. I'm Erin Suddeth. I'm the branch manager for the Title I Part A Support and Improvement branch, and I have a colleague here with me today, as always.
Hi, I'm David Malonti, one of the assistant directors in the division.
All right, for those of you joining us through Teams, as I said earlier, please be sure to go ahead and mute your microphone and turn off your camera just to ensure that all of the other participants can really focus on the presentation. Sometimes it can be a bit distracting to have somebody else's camera on. And you can do that up at the top of the Teams screen. You should see the microphone and camera buttons up there. Additionally, be careful if you are clicking around on any of the buttons in Teams so you don't accidentally take control of the presentation or share your screen or something like that. As always, you can submit questions or comments in the chat if you're on Teams, or you can send an email to me at erin.suddeth@education.ky.gov if you're joining us through the media portal. And our webinars are always recorded and posted on the Title I Documents and Resources page. We usually get those posted either later in the day of the webinar or the next day, and we keep them up for 1 year. So you can always go back and reference those if you need to. Okay, a recap from our November webinar. We had some different announcements and reminders, one of which was reminding everybody to get their comparability reports completed. And I want to thank everybody for the timely submission of those reports. At this point, they have all been reviewed and approved by KDE, so we really appreciate that. We also talked about comprehensive improvement planning and Title I Part A. If you weren't able to join us, be sure to go back and watch the recording. We talked about how documents like the needs assessment, the CDIP, the CSIP, things like that really inform the Title I Part A application and expenditures. And then we talked about how to monitor your program for effective implementation. So today's agenda does include revised allocations and information on the release of the 2021 census data. And before we get started on these topics, I want to go ahead and emphasize that both of these things have not happened yet. We don't have specific dates of when they will happen. I'm probably going to remind you of that a couple more times throughout the webinar, but this is kind of the general time of year when those things happen. So we thought it would be a good idea to just go ahead and discuss them, get everybody ready for when they do happen. Okay, so first up is revised allocations. Again, not available in GMAP yet. So your allocation can change, and the reason why is that Title I funds are appropriated by the U.S. Department of Education each year, but those amounts can be adjusted throughout the year, and they often are. Your base allocation amount is determined by the Department of Education, and it's based on tentative estimates of formula children, and those tentative estimates come from the U.S. Census Bureau. And then there are hold harmless amounts and qualification criteria for 4 different funding pots that make up the final allocation. The original application, that's what you've been working on for FY23, that is based on those tentative allocations, as not all the census data is final at that point. And no district is reduced below something called the hold harmless level, with the caveat, as long as Congress appropriates the adequate funding to meet all of those levels. One thing I want to point out is that changes in district allocations are not based on an increase or a decrease in the poverty percentage, enrollment numbers, free and reduced price lunch data, any of those types of things that are reported by the district. That does not impact this at all. We use those numbers often to determine rank and serve order of schools, but they're not actually used in determining the overall amount of the award. So for example, sometimes when the census information comes out, a district looks at their data and they compare it to their, say, free and reduced price lunch data, and they see all my free and reduced price lunch numbers went up at every school. Why did my numbers on this go down? And so that's a kind of a common misconception that an increase in free and reduced price lunch data just automatically means an increase in a tentative allocation. There are multiple variable factors that affect each district's allocation, so it's not really an apples to apples comparison. And we do have some more detailed explanations of the entire allocation process, formula children, hold harmless rates, things like that in the new Title I coordinator training video and the accompanying PowerPoint, which are both available on the Documents and Resources webpage. So we know that revised Title I Part A allocations are usually released a couple times a year. We're going to look at a typical timeline for that release. So again, this is typical. There are some circumstances in which the allocation timeline may be later than what's on the screen, but this is roughly what happens. So first is in the spring, the tentative allocations are released. Now, as I mentioned before, at that point, not all the census data is final. That's what makes it tentative. And we have you go ahead and complete that tentative application in GMAP. Then in late spring or early summer, we have a final allocation that's got some updated census data that is released. And what we do at KDE is we calculate the revised allocations, but we don't typically release it to districts unless there's a major change in the allocation. Then in the first part of October, we get the real final, and that is when KDE calculates and actually issues the final amount to districts, and that is when GMAP revisions are required. So the final amount, it could be the same as the tentative allocation, or there could be an increase or a decrease. As I mentioned before, the allocations are not reduced below the hold harmless amount, provided that adequate funding is available. So when your revised allocation amounts go into GMAP, you will need to go in and make revisions to your application. You can't go in and make revisions until that original tentative application has received full approval. So for the consolidated application, that means all of the programs within it have signed off. And when you look in GMAP, you see that status, KDE Consolidated Consultant Approved. In terms of Title I pages, that may require attention. District set-asides, the per pupil amount page, services to private schools if you serve private schools, and then of course the budget page. So we're going to take kind of a closer look at each of those pages and what types of changes would be required. So not every page is necessarily going to require a revision. But if your allocation amount does change, make sure that you pay attention to these. You don't want to just change one page, resubmit it, and then have it returned to you for corrections. So first page, district set-asides. You may need to align the new parent and family engagement set-aside to the 310, this year would be J budget. And also ensure that 90% of that required 1% reservation is distributed to the schools. Another reminder here that I thought of kind of last minute was that when you're maybe making changes to these amounts, remember that you cannot decrease the homeless set aside. Once that amount is in there, that's the amount that needs to be spent on those students. A number of other things could potentially be decreased, but not that one. Right, on the per pupil amount page, first thing you want to do is check the remaining balance. Make sure that it is 0 or as close to 0 as possible without being negative. And you can always address any tiny remaining amounts by adjusting either the PPAs, making sure that you're still maintaining rank and serve order, or you can adjust the amounts on the district set-aside page. So if you have a negative remainder on the PPA page, you could go and decrease a district set-aside by that amount, and that frees up that money to be used on the PPA page. If your PPAs do change and you've broken your budget down by location, you want to make sure that you go in the budget and you make the same changes so that the totals still align with the PPA page. For services to private schools, you'll need to check the new totals for the 310 JP and JN budgets. Make sure that the amounts on the private school page align with the budget page. And then the budget, as I've said multiple times, you just need to make sure that that aligns with the rest of the application. Now, you may also need to make other changes on pages depending on how the revised allocation impacts your program. For example, if the change is going to impact the number of staff that can be funded at a particular school, you might need to go in and update that school personnel and program description page and adjust some of those FTEs. As a reminder, we do have a series of GMAP training videos on the Documents and Resources webpage, and each of those has a really in-depth explanation and walkthrough of each page. So now we're going to transition from talking about the current school year to thinking about the 2023-24 school year and how that census data is used to estimate poverty percentages, determine hold harmless rates, all of that. And this is going to allow you to begin making some rough plans for the next school year. So again, this data is not available yet. Once it becomes available, it typically goes out in a Commissioner's Monday message, as well as a direct email to coordinators. USAID is going to use the 2021 census data to calculate school year 23-24 allocations for Title I Part A. And then KDE issues that data to districts for planning purposes for the 23-24 school year. So again, note that any numbers provided are tentative and they are subject to change. Data can be used to calculate an estimate of your 23-24 allocation. So where do these numbers come from? The Census Bureau uses this information to determine estimates, which it then provides to the U.S. Department of Education. And here are some of the things that they look at. We've got the Census Bureau's American Community Survey, some information from federal income tax returns, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program data, the most recent decennial census, any updates to population estimates, supplemental income recipients, and economic data from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. So there's a lot of data that goes into these numbers. And I said this before, these numbers don't reflect any reporting that KDE submits to the U.S. Department of Education or that districts submit to KDE. It's nothing that you can pull from Infinite Campus. So the list of LEAs or districts used for the census estimates are based on the 2021-22 school year district boundary survey conducted by the Census Bureau, and that's with the help of district mapping coordinator in our state. And the LEAs on the list include only regular LEAs that have geographic boundaries. And let's see. The surveys are conducted to just verify the number of students, remove any districts that closed or were absorbed by other districts. We didn't have anything like that this year. So when you get this document, you will see kind of some information on the first couple pages and then a table. The table provides the estimated number of related children ages 5 to 17 in families of poverty, the estimated total ages of children ages 5 to 17, and the estimated total resident population for each district. It does not include other children counted in the formula, such as foster children or children in facilities for neglected students. And again, census data is not complete, which is why we keep referencing tentative numbers at this point. So, for example, some of that data is not completed until, say, June. So the hold harmless amount, this is the rock bottom dollar amount that your district may receive in a fiscal year. It is variable and again, contingent upon adequate funding being available. This is based on the previous year's Title I Part A allocation. So your hold harmless percentage, there's 3 different options. It could be 95%, 90%, or 85%. It's 95% if your census poverty average is 30% or greater. It's 90% if the census poverty percentage is between 15 and 30%. And then it's 85% if the census poverty percentage is below 15%. And we're going to kind of look at an example of that because it can be a little bit confusing. So this is the general layout of the chart that you'll see once this document is made available. Poverty percentages are reported to 2 decimal places, and they are not rounded to the nearest whole number when determining hold harmless percentages. So if we just kind of look at this, we can see the list of districts on the left. Then we have that tentative number of formula children for each district, the tentative population for children ages 5 to 17, and the tentative poverty percentage. Then we've got the hold harmless percentages for that school year. So you can see for District A, their tentative poverty percentage is 26.61. That's between 15 and 30%. So their hold harmless rate is 90%. Whereas District B, their poverty percentage is below 15%, which means their hold harmless percentage is 85, and so on. So be sure that you read this document very carefully once it comes out. As in prior years, the Census Bureau always provides a challenge period for local school districts to review the poverty information, the population data, and look for certain non-statistical errors. The potential errors could fall into 2 categories. The first one is some sort of processing input data or running the estimation models error. And then the other possible error is related to the information used to define the geographic boundaries, the school district boundaries. Now, generally, the Census Bureau does not make changes to the data except in the case of a data error. So it's always a good idea to also compare last year's data to this year's data and just kind of make a note of any trends. And we typically include as a reference when we give you this chart your last year's poverty percentage, just so you can kind of start looking for trends. For example, if you're starting to see a downward trend in poverty percentage, it could eventually result in a lower hold harmless percentage if you've kind of been right there on the bubble for a few years. And districts and schools just need to keep in mind how that will impact their programs. So we don't have a due date for the challenge period yet. It's typically mid-March. In previous years, it's been March 16th, March 8th, so we can probably estimate that it'll be sometime in there. And we will provide reminders about that in newsletters and webinars and things. So as I said, the challenges can be based on the 2 factors outlined on the previous slide. The district can contact the Small Area Income and Poverty Estimates branch at the Census Bureau for further information on how to challenge any of the data. And KDE cannot revise your census estimates. Only the U.S. Census Bureau can do so. So if you review this and you see something that you think is an error and falls into one of these categories that I've discussed and will be explained in the document, that's who you need to contact. And all of that contact information will be available in the document. So do we have any questions? I don't see any in the chat. I'm going to check the email quickly. I don't see any questions on email. So if you think of a question, go ahead and put it in the chat or send it in an email, and we'll do another check before we sign off. Couple last minute reminders, the 2023 National ESEA Conference. This is a conference that's aimed at coordination among federal education programs that are under the ESEA. Used to be called the National Title I Conference. You may be familiar with that name. And this event is committed to sharing resources pertinent to Title I and many other federally funded education programs. So participants include state agency officials, district administrators, building leaders, teachers, all kinds of different people. This year's conference is being held February 1st through the 4th in Indianapolis. It's going to have more than 100 sessions and 4 keynote speakers. It is a hybrid conference event, so you can join virtually or in person. The early bird registration prices are available through the end of this month, December 31st. After that, it will be the full price. There's additional information available on the 2023 National ESEA Conference webpage, which is linked on the slide that I sent you. And then our upcoming webinar dates for the first 6 months of 2023. Our next webinar is going to be on Thursday, January 26th at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, as always. I also want to remind you that we are always welcoming your feedback and would love to learn about what's helpful for you, what you want to see more of in our webinars or our newsletters or anything like that. Any comments, ideas, or questions can, of course, be submitted directly to me or your consultant, or if you prefer to do it anonymously, we do have a feedback survey that is always linked in the Title I newsletter. You can go on and submit anonymous feedback that way. And I'll do a last check for questions. Okay, we did get one. Did I mention when we could expect the final allocation in GMAP? We don't have a date for that at this point. So no, I didn't mention that. I'm sorry. I wish I did. All right, well, if there are no more questions, we will go ahead and let you go, and everybody have a happy and restful holiday break.